Thank you, Mo. Mr. Choi Shin-ko, Director and Chief Executive Officer, ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute. Mr. Andreas Klein, Director, Regional Political Dialogue Program Asia, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second session of the 37th ASEAN Roundtable. It's my pleasure to be your moderator for this session. Ladies and gentlemen, earlier phases of globalization and the fragmentation of production processes has linked economies together through trade and investment and global value chains. ASEAN has grown from this earlier phase of globalization and global value chains. So it is inevitable that ASEAN is also exposed to external shocks, such as the Russia-Ukraine war and other wars that will influence the growth in the region through its trade and investment ties with each other, as well as with the outside world. We have with us speakers who will explain the impact of these shocks on the ASEAN economies as well as ASEAN integration. We also have with us speakers who will provide insights on the opportunities for growth through digital trade. We are very honored to have with us Ms. Syetarn Hansakul, Analyst, Economic Intelligence Unit, my colleague, Dr. Jayant Menon, Senior Fellow at ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute, and Ms. Alpana Roy, Singapore's Senior Economic Official to ASEAN and Director ASEAN, Ministry of Trade and Industry Singapore, to share with us their insights on these critical issues. I will invite them to speak in the order as stated in the program. Please note that you have 15 minutes each to share your insights so that we have some time left for question and answer. The session will be open to the floor after all speakers have shared their views. So may I now hand over the mic to Ms. Hansakul, who will share with us on assessing the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on ASEAN economies. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tham. Thank you, ISIS, for inviting me. Okay, is it better now? Okay, good. Yes. Good morning, Director Choi, Mr. Klein, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me today to share the view from the Economist Intelligence Unit on what the Ukraine war has done to the world and to ASEAN. So my job is a little bit easier because I will tell you what are the challenges, and then my fellow panelists will probably give the prescription. But before I go into the prepared presentation, I'd just like to add a few words that after having listened to the speakers this morning, it made me ask myself, is ASEAN still relevant after 55 years? What will Dr. Thanat Khoman and the founding fathers think if he sees us today? And I think we have some reason to be proud of the past 55 years. ASEAN has been through a lot. The 1970s was a very difficult years for countries like Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. We survived and even prospered. We went through the oil crisis of the 1970s. We've seen the Asian financial crisis in 1997, global financial crisis in 2008. And here we are, confronting with another war and a very difficult global order. So now I will go into my prepared presentation. What has the Ukraine war done to the world? What are the implications? So I will state the obvious: commodities prices. Of course, commodity prices have soared sky high. With the disruption in Russia and Ukraine, which are the major exporters of many key commodities to the world, wheat, many other things, oil and gas, as well as industrial gases used in producing microchips, all these are severely disrupted. So sanctions are also imposed on Russia. And this is, of course, adding cost to the producers, and which is being passed on to consumers. There's compliance cost, and oil and gas will continue to stay high as long as the war rages on. And as far as we know, there is no real prospect for the war to end. There is even higher risk of the escalation. We have inflation, which is very high. Again, I'm stating the obvious. And the EIU actually sees inflation rising over 9% globally this year. And this is up from last year of 5% and higher than the historical pattern. Supply chain has been disrupted as we were just emerging out of COVID, the pandemic. We were hoping that the supply chain bottlenecks will ease, but no, Ukraine came along and sent forecasters like myself and our team scramble to rework our forecast again in February. And central banks were also caught off guard. They had to hike interest rates to try to manage the inflation expectation. And this, of course, will have implications to the economies around the world. And inflation is yet to be tamed. And this has severe implication for global growth. Most impacted are the countries in Europe, Germany and in Eastern Europe. Western Europe has been able to be a little bit more insulated, but nevertheless, they are quite affected. So we actually are revising down our global forecast for for EU 27 growth down by 1% in 2022 and 3% down from initial forecast in 2023. So we are actually forecasting a recession in Europe in 2023. The downgrade to growth is not only in Europe, but in most of the G20 economies. And the exception for 2022 is mainly on the commodity producers countries. So the next question that I'd like to address is, are we going to see a global recession? A global recession in 2022 has always been unlikely. And this is because of the easing or unwinding of the COVID restriction measures. This has allowed many economies in the world to see the rebound in domestic demand, and the easing of international travel rules have helped us to start to travel, meet each other like today, and international borders are open again. So that has been one of the impetus for growth in 2022, but will that be enough to help us meet the challenges in 2023? I'm not so sure. And we have a pretty solid growth in Asia, some in ASEAN, which actually exceeded our expectation in 2022. I will mention especially in Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. These three countries have seen stronger growth than we have expected. But then again, after having delivered the good news, in some major economies in the Western Europe, we expect them to see a technical recession in the fourth quarter of this year and in early 2023. And this includes Germany, Italy, France, and the UK. Risks are concentrated in 2023. We have revised our growth down, and then global growth will we won't see a global recession, but we will see a much slower growth in 2023 of 1.6%. And this is a result of many things. The geopolitical risks are actually getting more difficult and imposing costs on the way we do business and the way we trade. And global monetary tightening, which has started in 2022, is going to have an impact, a delayed impact in 2023 on domestic demand, both consumption and investment. And risks that are already in place are going to probably intensify in 2023. This includes the situation in the Middle East, what's happening in Iran, the escalation, possible escalation of the war in Ukraine. I hope that won't happen, but we, like Professor Kishore said, we cannot be too complacent. And COVID-19 variant is still around. We think we know how to cope with it better, but it's still around. And countries like China, which is a major locomotive for the world economy, is still pretty much affected by it. We have the sovereign debt pile up after many years that we need fiscal subsidies. So this is going to constrain government spending as well. So the benign environment that used to be conducive to world growth in the period of up to 2018 is gone, unfortunately. Geopolitics are, I think the previous session has talked about it. We have US-China rivalry, we have the war in Ukraine, and we have the question over Taiwan, and this is going to impact investment environment. So on the other side, we have low interest rate environment, which has ended. So the lower for longer is no longer with us, and this is going to increase the financing costs for the business sector. So governments and businesses alike face tough decisions. What do we do with trade? Do we lock down again when we have a new COVID variant emerging? What do we do? So many questions that tough decisions that have to be made in 2023. And this highlights only the very importance of policy credibility and good governance. In time of challenges, countries need to maintain their credibility to avoid panic and market dislocation. So the next one, easier on your eyes. This is my graphic illustration of how things will get worse in 2023. So blue means very cold or deep freeze, and the lighter colors or the red means that it's still doing quite well. So we still see a pretty good bright spot in one of the ASEAN countries, Vietnam, and the rest of the ASEAN countries are either green or orange. So that's why I said Dr. Thanat Khoman and the founding fathers of ASEAN would still be proud. ASEAN is not insulated from the challenges in the world, but ASEAN must have done something right to continue to thrive or deal with the situation. But that is not a source for complacency, because we need to adapt to the situation that might worsen. So in short, I will not do a poll whether ASEAN will avoid a recession in 2023. I will just tell you, we don't think that ASEAN will have a recession, but it will face a very difficult challenges. So strong headwinds to ASEAN growth in 2023, but no recession. Most of the countries in ASEAN in 2023 will see slower growth, some quite significantly. There are only 3 odd ones out that will probably see slightly stronger growth, and that's Brunei, Laos, and Thailand. And in case of Thailand, it's because they were quite a late comer in recovering from COVID. So and the opening up of the tourism sector, that's helping, but it's not a significant, much larger growth compared to 2022. And what about inflation? We feel that inflation in 2023 will improve from 2022, but it's not going to be back to the old low inflation environment, and the inflation risk is still there. So we have to be mindful and be wary. So we have 6 key challenges facing ASEAN in 2023: slower growth, high inflation, and the fiscal consolidation will be delayed. We have strong US dollar, which is taking most ASEAN economies much, much weaker. And this has resulted in a sharp drop in foreign exchange reserves. And this is denting confidence. So it's something that the central banks need to contend with and manage the confidence going forward. Because like I mentioned before, confidence is really key in a difficult year. We have high interest rates, which is going to be difficult for many borrowers, and many countries have a fragile group of borrowers. So we probably will see some sort of help or support packages, which should be targeted to help those needed. And last but not least, we have geopolitical fragmentation. That is a very difficult challenge, but that has been quite well discussed in the earlier panel already. So in conclusion, I'll just highlight the 5 ways that coronavirus and war in Ukraine has affected the way the global business is being conducted. Number 1, we have a new push for defense spending. So in Europe, you can say that NATO now has a new reason for raison d'etre, for the reason for being. We have weaponization of the finance sanctions. So this is going to deepen, and this will only push countries like Russia and China to look for different ways for them to engage with the world. Being left out of SWIFT, no problem. We will look for other ways. And this can probably actually, if you look at opportunities in the time of crisis, this is time that will give rise to the fintech business. Third way that is changing the world is the green transition that is diverging. In the developed countries, the push for renewables will be even more important. It's their way to survive. But in developing countries, we will see some retracement to fossil fuel again. So I won't say that it's an abandonment, but probably a delay to the commitment to reduce the carbon emission. Then we have the technology that is getting more geopolitical. Again, this is a very difficult environment for businesses to operate in. You have to comply to 2 sets of rules, and then you have to, I guess, face punishments or fines. It's a very difficult situation for companies in many sectors. And last but not least, we have commodities coming back right in focus again. The issue of food insecurity is rearing its head, and it's something that you've seen ASEAN already reacting with Malaysia with the chicken export ban, Indonesia imposing the temporary ban on palm oil. So these are the kind of things that we probably will see a replay, and food insecurity as long as the war in Ukraine rages. And this actually extends to other commodities as well. Yeah, both hard and soft commodities. So that's where I will end my presentation. And I think for the prescriptions, I conveniently leave it to my panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hansakul, for walking us through the impact of the war on Europe's growth, its spillover into ASEAN, the challenges the ASEAN faces, as well as the new ways of doing business. We'd like now to invite my colleague, Dr. Jayant Menon, to give his views on the other risks that faces ASEAN in the coming years. Jay, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yean, and Mr. Choi, Mr. Klein, and ladies and gentlemen. My presentation today will try and complement as much as possible what's already been said by Syetarn. What I will try and do is talk initially but quickly about the short-term outlook for ASEAN, but complementing the EIU's projections with what the IMF and the ADB think. No one has a monopoly on wisdom with these forecasts, so I think it's useful to think about what others also have to say. It turns out they all pretty much say the same thing, but with nuances, which are also interesting. And then I want to talk about some of those underlying trends, both in the short term and the medium term. Short term and medium term and the long term. So in the short term, I'll talk about the trade, technology, and now we have a real war, and focus in a bit more on the rising protectionism and anti-globalization sentiment that are creating new risks and challenges. We've already heard about this earlier on today in the first session and from the Minister. Then I want to talk a bit about how there are these underlying longer-term trends which are actually shaping the short-term trends as well. The long-term trends on technology, demography, environment, and distribution or inequality will play out fully over time, but they're already impinging on our daily lives right now. So we cannot ignore those long-term trends in understanding what's going to happen in the short term. And finally, I will try and come back to what I'm supposed to be talking about, which is the role of IPEF and Asian FTAs in the prescriptive sense of how or what role they can play in addressing these risks and challenges. And here I want to blame Kishore for already saying that IPEF is kosong or empty. I think it's too early, actually, to be sure that it will be kosong. It might be worse than kosong. It could be negative, of course, or it could be something a bit better than that. But because it's too early, there've only been 2 ministerial meetings so far, the highlights of which included India pulling out of trade. So there's not much that can be said now, so I don't want to make a presentation on what could be or might be, but I will come back to this right at the end and place in the context of other Asian FTAs. Right. So this is the latest growth projections from the IMF about the world. Again, as Syetarn has mentioned, the issue is not this year, but next year. The IMF is projecting growth 3.2% and slight slowdown to 2.7% next year. They've kept revising this down up to October, but in the far right-hand panel, you can see that the developing and emerging Asia is sort of the bright spot, growing faster than other parts of the world. The only faster performer this year is the Middle East because of the terms of trade gain from oil prices. But generally, this region is looking good compared to the rest of the world. This is the ADB's forecast for ASEAN or Southeast Asia, for them, which includes Timor-Leste. Overall growth this year is forecast to come in at 5.1, with very little change next year at 5. ADB is quite optimistic. These are the numbers across the region. And I think this, I won't go through the country numbers because they correspond very closely to what the EIU thinks that Syetarn just described. But the IMF is more pessimistic, I should say. than the EIU about China. So they see China slowing quite a bit this year and next year. And India, although it might look good at 6.8 and 6.1, is a huge downward revision from what they thought earlier. ASEAN 5 is similarly around 5%, but here the 5 excludes Singapore but includes Vietnam on top of the original 4. Right. So that's a picture quite similar to what we've heard, perhaps a bit more pessimistic, I think, than the EIU, but not much. So the short to medium-term trends underlie that all these numbers imply, I think, are more important to look at more closely. The first is the trade and increasingly now technology war, or what's described the US-China great competition. Of course, we've heard already how this region, ASEAN, doesn't want to be caught in the middle, doesn't want to take sides, but whatever whatever the case might be, it will be affected, especially through increasing levels of disruption to China-centered regional supply chains. So I think we cannot escape from that reality that supply chains for ASEAN remain China-centered and is likely to continue to remain China-centered. There are relocations taking place and shifts and so on that we often read about, but by and large, in the key sectors of electronics and automotive parts and components and machinery, there hasn't been so far much shift out of China in those capital-intensive sectors. So that, I think, is important to bear in mind. But also it's important to say that that shift can happen if the US-China trade war escalates much further. So it's not that it can never happen, it just hasn't happened yet. And if this escalation continues, and if Kishore is right in that it can only get worse and get much worse, then I think we will see some big shifts that will be very disruptive to ASEAN going forward. And I'll come back to that a bit later. Of course, now we have a real war taking place, and I won't say much about this because I think Syetarn has covered it very well. But then all of this is happening and fueling in a climate of rising protectionism and anti-globalization sentiments. This is driving and being driven by all of these different types of wars, and of course it's been accelerated by the pandemic. And it is this point that I want to spend a bit of time on in terms of the risks that it poses for ASEAN's recovery as well as ongoing integration efforts. So I think there's a few key things here that are happening that we need to pay attention to. And the first is the shift from restricting outputs to inputs. So in the past, protectionism was mostly about restricting outputs, both goods and services, but now we are seeing a lot more restrictions on the inputs, capital, labor, and technology. And in technology, I include data. I'm sure Alpana will tell us a lot more about this later. But that's the first trend, the shift from outputs to inputs. The second is the shift from taxes to subsidies. Here we see things like the CHIPS Act and so on, trying to re-engineer a supply chain, to bring it back home, reshoring through bribes, which has so far failed and I think will continue to fail. But that's another thing we should bear in mind. The instruments are changing from taxes to subsidies and from tariffs to non-tariff barriers. This is an ongoing trend, but escalated in the US-China trade war. So I think this is the big fear economically. When the instrument moves from tariffs, which is easy to define, and the effects we can measure quite well with our models, but non-tariff barriers, when it becomes things like bans on technology use, on people movement, on delistings, on stock exchanges, all of which we're already starting to see. This is where I think the cost will escalate almost exponentially, and this is the fear going forward. There's also a shift from restricting imports to exports. Syetarn just mentioned this, the various bans on exports we've seen in ASEAN in relation to agricultural products mainly, but this again can broaden to other sectors, and that is something to keep an eye on. And finally, I think we're seeing a shift in the discourse that no longer talks about policies, but rather values. And I think this is important to understand because this is protectionism in disguise that makes it very difficult to actually argue against. We now talk about things like resilience and self-reliance as if these are aspirations that shouldn't be questioned, but really they underlie protectionist policies that are presented in new clothing. So there's also a difference between resilience and self-reliance. You don't have to be self-reliant to increase resilience, but even resilience often is presented as a pretext for protectionism. Right. Okay, I'm running out of time, but let me quickly move on to some of these mega trends, and I'll be very quick here, that I think impinge upon the short term, as I mentioned. But here, the first is the technological changes that are taking place. I think Alpana will talk about a lot of the benefits that are coming out of this technological changes, but there are also costs, and the digital economy is disrupting labor markets in ASEAN in particular, and there's a rising need for labor mobility at a time where the appetite for it is fading. And this is the anti-globalization sentiment that's rising. On top of that need for increasing labor mobility because of the disruption to labor markets, especially at the lower end of the skill spectrum, we have divergent demographics taking place. The minister this morning mentioned how ASEAN is actually lucky in having 60% of its population under the age of 35, but that is also shifting, and that is not equally distributed across countries. You can see that the peak for a lot of the younger populations has been reached or is being reached, and it's really in the Mekong countries where the younger populations are still present and rising, and the labor markets are bulging. The drop-off in other parts of ASEAN will take place very soon, or has already started to take place, right? So that's something I think we should keep in mind in terms of the demographic dividend. It's there, it's better than other parts of the world, but it's creeping up on many countries very quickly, the aging phenomenon. Climate change, there's too much to be said about this, so I won't say anything except to say that it is the existential challenge we are facing. But all of these long-term trends, I think, combined in the form of threatening social cohesion and political order through rising inequality. And this is something we will need to face going forward. Right. So in this limited amount of time I have now, very quickly, let me talk about how we try and address all of this. I think, as I said, there's a need to actually increase both labor and capital mobility at a time where the appetite for it is fading. All the talk about retrenching, reshoring is about retrenching FDI. So it's not just stopping FDI or capital flows, it's reversing capital flows. So this is something I think we need to guard against. And this is where I think regional agreements like ASEAN and the AEC need to play a bigger role. I think the appetite for dealing with factor flows in these agreements is limited. It's difficult, it's too sensitive. ASEAN, for instance, only deals with skilled labor movements. Unskilled labor movements are too sensitive. There's some of this is dealt better in bilateral agreements, but even the CPTPP and RCEP have not been able to do much about factor movements. But I think trade can substitute for some of the factor movements that we find difficult to do. So the effects can be replicated to some extent by equalizing wages and rentals on capital, and that can come through trade. And so even if we can't do much directly about factor movements, if we can continue liberalizing trade, that can help with the adjustment costs. Now, how about IPEF? Okay, so I think IPEF will probably struggle to liberalize trade. As I mentioned, India has already pulled out of the trade negotiations, a trade pillar, because they still have a very mercantilistic approach to trade, as do many countries, by the way. I don't want to single out India here, but without actually providing the carrots, like the exchange of concessions, trade concessions, it is very difficult to sell all the other pillars that come with IPEF on environment and on other rules that will involve short-term costs for long-term gains. This is not the right climate to sell that kind of package, and I think there is also a risk that IPEF could lead to further bifurcation if it leads to this, escalation of the US-China competition and disrupt further these China-centered regional supply chains. So IPEF appears to be, I think, probably a little bit weak on the trade front. We'll have to wait and see. Maybe the US will do more to try and increase the carrots, but there's also a small risk that it actually worsened the situation by actually increasing the rivalry. So with that, I'm sorry to have taken a bit more time, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jay, for highlighting the other challenges that the region faces in terms of trade and technology, rising protectionism, and its impact on escalating anti-trade trends in the short term, and as well as the long-term risks that the region is facing. May I now invite Ms. Alpana to share with us, hopefully, some sunshine on the opportunities of digital trade for the region. Over to you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Yean. Good morning to Mr. Choi Shing Kwok, Mr. Klein, and ladies and gentlemen. I was asked to talk, as Yean mentioned, about whether digital economy agreements or DEAs are the way to go. So taking a leaf from, I suppose, the theme of prescriptions that both Syetarn and Jay touched on, I suppose this could be one possible prescription that we can look into. But I think before we look at that, we need to first understand what the digital economy means for Southeast Asia, exactly what are DEAs, and here I'll just touch a little bit upon what Singapore's experience has been, and then move over to the ASEAN setting. I think we're all aware that the pandemic catalyzed digitalization exponentially, and the World Bank estimates that the digital economy contributes to more than 15% of GDP. And over the next decade, there are some estimates that suggest that approximately 70% of new value created in the economy will be derived from digitally enabled platforms. And Southeast Asia is well placed to harness this. but doing so will not be easy. And I think both Syetarn and Jay have talked about the global headwinds that are facing Southeast Asia. I'll touch on this briefly, which is geopolitical frictions with the increased risks of technological bifurcation, I think, which is quite relevant to this topic. The rising interest rates, inflationary pressures, and energy crunch, supply chain disruptions, along with continued protectionism and the urgent need to deal with climate issues. But despite this, if you've read the recently released E-Economy Southeast Asia Report 2022 by Google, Temasek, and Bain & Company, who acknowledged these headwinds, but actually found that the region's digital economy remains on course to reach US $200 billion in gross merchandise value this year, a full 3 years earlier than expected. The report also has some useful data points. For example, the digital economy in the region creates 160,000 high-skilled jobs, indirectly supports 30 million jobs, while platforms have enabled over 20 million merchants and 6 million restaurants to grow their businesses. And overall, Southeast Asia's economy is also projected to grow further with the potential to reach up to US $1 trillion by 2030. So the question is then, what role exactly do DAs play? And there are a number of reports that talk about this, but I'll try and condense some of their rationale. Very briefly, if you look at the global landscape for the digital economy, it is both complex and it is fragmented. And nearly 2/3 of regional trade agreements, they include e-commerce or digital trade provisions, but they're very contained, very limited to issues such as data, privacy, and some other selected issues. But I think in the recent year or two, we've seen a wider ranging set of DEAs trying to address broader digital-related rules. And apart from some of the elements I just cited, these DAs also try to talk about emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, data innovation, and so on. Their DAs, they range in their modality, but one example is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which is actually very collaborative and agile in nature, with some rules starting with softer norms and meant to evolve over time. And this is quite practical because in the digital age, it's quite hard to write binding rules at present, given the evolution of the industry. And this is quite something that, I think it's an approach that ASEAN can think about, and I'll come to that a little bit later. The broader DAs are also important because the distinctions between what is and what isn't digital are becoming much more a blur. And they're blurring. A number of reports and studies also point to multiple impediments that inject considerable friction and cost into doing business digitally, especially for small firms and those from developing countries. And some of these impediments can range from data-related regulations that Jay touched on, restrictions on digital services, bottlenecks for digitally enabled goods trade, for example. So I think the need for clearer, more consistent and predictable rules, as well as the cost of inaction, are quite clear or significant. But I think setting broader digital economy rules can be also challenging. There will be difficulties in reducing barriers to what are complex issues, barriers which are unique to certain domestic contexts, the lack of access to the necessary infrastructure, or the lack of ability to effectively leverage digitalization, to name a few. So I think I'll just move on to what exactly DAs do. And for this, let me just briefly touch on what Singapore has been doing and what our experience has been on this. So for us, we do believe that rules can play a role in addressing these challenges and are an important component, not the only component, in harnessing the potential of the digital economy. And let me share how we think about this. Fundamentally, to reap benefits, you need to create a conducive, secure, and enabling environment for the digital economy to thrive, and that is quite critical. But at the same time, the global international trade rules have not kept pace with these new realities. So we have partnered with like-minded governments to develop DEAs to support our businesses and businesses in these countries in navigating the very landscape of fragmental rules that I talked about, as well as standards and policies, which has made compliance and cost difficult for businesses. These DEAs help to build international frameworks to foster greater interoperability, align standards and policies to create a more streamlined and trade-friendly environment. And amongst other objectives, they try to seek to facilitate seamless end-to-end digital trade, enable an open and trusted use of data, and hopefully build trust in digital systems. In the longer term, DAs function as a way for us to update our rules and keep up with the ever-growing digital needs in a sustainable manner. So far, we have concluded 4 such agreements with 5 countries. They are Australia, Chile, New Zealand, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. Some of these agreements have also drawn interest from the other countries as well. We also, apart from DAs, we also collaborate in a number of other ways with other partners on digital-related initiatives, some of them with countries in the region. An example of this is Malaysia. But at the same time, I think it's important to know that DAs cannot exist in the abstract. They have to be tangible to benefit businesses. So the DAs that we look at try to encourage cooperative projects on innovative applications and use cases, allowing us to test ideas for our businesses and workers to learn from best practices. So for example, under the Singapore-Australia DEA, we partnered Australia to undertake projects in data analytics, data innovation. Another example is e-invoicing provisions. As businesses transact across borders, the ability to transmit invoices electronically increases their efficiency, the accuracy, and the reliability of these transactions. And at the individual level, the DEAs also help to enhance consumer protection in areas such as data privacy, cybersecurity, and fraud, hopefully allowing individuals to participate in the digital economy with greater peace of mind. Inclusivity is also another important area for DEAs to look at. At the Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce at the WTO, Singapore, along with Australia and Japan, launched the e-commerce capacity building framework to bring in a wider range of capacity building efforts to support developing and least developed countries participate in the GSI. And this can play a critical role in ensuring that such initiatives deliver more widely. I think we're quite clear that at the end of the day, whatever we do to facilitate trade in the digital economy cannot be done by government alone. So DAs are only part of the equation if we really want to create an ecosystem for the digital economy to thrive. So apart from agreements, I think we very much value public-private partnerships, working with SMEs, and we also place importance on digital upskilling at multiple levels. And some practical examples of this would be the Trade Data Exchange, or SG TradeX, which actually facilitates the sharing of data amongst actors in the supply chain ecosystem in a trusted, secure, and inclusive manner, and efforts are ongoing to expand this. In addition, we have programs such as the SMEs Go Digital to help firms and workers grow and upgrade through financial incentives and technical support, as well as Digital for Life to encourage Singapore to embrace digital learning as a lifelong pursuit. Let me now move on to what is happening in ASEAN. And ASEAN's digital transformation journey is still a work in progress. And you will see at the national level that actually all 10 ASEAN member states continue to take important steps to collectively harness the potential of the digital economy at different rates of adoption, unique to the respective context. Let me focus on the ASEAN level, and here I talk about the range of frameworks and roadmaps and initiatives that ASEAN has developed. And these can be quite a mouthful. You know, in ASEAN, we come up with a lot of these plans and frameworks and all of that. So just to run through very quickly, we have the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025, an ASEAN Digital Master Plan 2025. We have an ASEAN Digital Integration Framework Action Plan. We have an Bandar Seri Begawan Roadmap on Digital Transformation. Again, all a mouthful, but put that aside. Look into these documents. The important things to focus on is that they actually contain fairly detailed actions and initiatives to grow ASEAN's digital economy. And the specifics, once you unpack them, actually take the form of modular initiatives and use case cooperation. And a number of them are actually already progressing, but somehow doesn't quite seem to receive that much attention. For example, you have ASEAN collaborating in areas such as cybersecurity, digital payments, trade facilitation, data flows, and so on. Some of these are region-wide efforts, some of these are pathfinders, some of these are more mature, some of these are more nascent. We've also made strides in rulemaking, such as through the ASEAN Agreement on E-commerce and the RCEP Agreement's e-commerce chapter, and I think what is ongoing, which is the upgrade of the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand FTA, which Minister Vivian Balakrishnan talked about. So then, what is the next bound for ASEAN's digital economy aspirations? I think ASEAN recognizes that they do need a set of comprehensive rules if we really want to underscore our value proposition in a digital world. And to this end, I think Minister also talked about how ASEAN member states are developing their very own DEA, and that's called the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement, also known as the DEFA. It aims to be comprehensive. I can't speak too much about it because ASEAN is still undertaking a scoping study, and they hope to complete that study next year and launch negotiations on this shortly thereafter, hopefully in Indonesia's chairmanship year. Now, in terms of substance, the various modules in the DEAs, ASEAN's various modular initiatives can be useful reference points in constructing the ASEAN DEFA, but ultimately an ASEAN DEFA must speak to 6 things. First, it has to be ASEAN-centric, and it needs to consider the differing levels of digital readiness in the region. Second, it has to be interoperable with international standards. Third, it has to be relevant and agile in meeting business needs. Fourth, it has to be inclusive in addressing the aspirations of people in ASEAN. Fifth, engender trust and confidence in the region's regulatory environment. And it also, lastly, must take into account sustainability. As this is a growing, I think the digitalization does come with a growing carbon footprint. Given the pace of technological developments, there must also be room for dialogue between governments, industry players, and other stakeholders to promote sharing ideas, experiences, and best practices when developing ASEAN's DEFA. It should not take place in a vacuum. And for Singapore, we look forward to working with our ASEAN neighbors on this enterprise. In conclusion, and to answer the question posed by the session, I think as the digital economy continues to grow, so will the importance of DEAs. And for small and open economies and for countries in the region, connecting seamlessly with the rest of the world's digital economy is essential to continue growing and creating opportunities for our people. There will undoubtedly be challenges, and we'll have to address that together. We also need to recognize there is no one-size-fits-all templates for such agreements, and DEAs on their own cannot create a conducive environment for the digital economy to flourish. For the region, an ASEAN DEFA needs not only to be done, it has to be done right. And if it is done right and it is well implemented, the DEFA can play an important role in positioning the ASEAN region as a compelling node for businesses in the digital age, propelling its growth over the longer term, and underscoring its strategic value proposition in a contested global digital landscape. But for ASEAN to get there, it needs to be committed, it needs to be bold, and it needs to be creative. With this, I come to the end of my remarks. Thanks, Yean.
Thank you so much for a very succinct summary on the potential of the digital economy, why DEAs are important, and being able to condense. I find this amazing, all the things that ASEAN has done in the digital space in 5 minutes. So thank you so much for the different views from the panel. I would like to open now the session to the floor.